the ultimate guide to flood insurance. We're talking about how can you minimize the impact on your wallet today, tomorrow? How could you potentially impact your property value and get flood insurance taken care of as quick as possible? But before we get started, make sure to subscribe, share, and like the channel so we can help share this content. Hello, my name is Chris Green, Flood Insurance Guru. More than 12 years ago, I bought a house in a flood zone just like this. I was told premiums are going to be $3,000 when they should have been $300. You see, I didn't have a guide to flood insurance. I didn't really know much of what I was doing, even though I had an educational background in flood mitigation. And this is why I have built this guide for you as a homeowner and a real estate investor so that you don't have to go through the same pains that I went through more than a decade ago. So today, let's talk about all these different things. We're going to be talking about flood zones. We're going to be talking about flood risk score, flood insurance options, understanding the basics of flood insurance. So those are some of the things we're going to discuss in this video. So by the time you get done with this video, you should be able to have the confidence to go and purchase flood insurance, knowing that you have the right coverage in place, you have the right price, and you've done the things you need to as a homeowner or a real estate investor to be successful in getting the best flood insurance. So first of all, let's talk about flood zones. This is a big thing we hear from people every day. What does my flood zone mean, or what flood zone am I in? You see, as we stand here right here, we're standing in a high-risk flood zone. So briefly, let's talk about high-risk flood zones and low risk. What are some of the differences with these? Let's talk about high risk. We're talking about, like we're standing here, flood zone AE. Anything that begins with flood zone A or begins with flood zone V as in Victor, these are what's called high risk flood zones. These fall within the 100-year flood plain or the 100-year area. This means they have an annual 1% chance of flooding. It also typically is where flood insurance is going to be required if you have a mortgage. So remember that if you're taking out any kind of loan, typically flood insurance is going to be required in these areas. Now let's talk about those low risk areas. We're talking about areas like anything really that begins with flood zone X, maybe B as in boy, or even D as in dog if it hasn't been determined yet. These are areas where flood insurance typically is not going to be required if you're taking out a mortgage. Does that mean you shouldn't purchase flood insurance? Absolutely not. More than 30% of claims actually come out of those low risk areas because of climate change, land development. Heck, you could probably even hear the bulldozer behind me right now who is clearing this land. These are all things that change a flood zone. So briefly, those are high risk and low risk flood zones. Now that we talked about flood zones, let's talk about flood risk score, because this can have a bigger impact on your flood insurance than the actual flood zone. Remember, most flood insurance companies are not even using flood zones anymore in their rates most of the time. They're using this flood risk modeling, the scoring. What does it all mean? So in the description below this video, you can actually get the flood risk score on your property. There's a lot of different things they look at, like distance to water, the type of flooding. Is it a coastal flooding area, river, or lake flooding like you can see here behind me, flash flooding? What is the flooding frequency? The replacement cost of your property, the actual cost to replace it if it was going to be destroyed, is something else they use. They look at your elevation. How far above the flood level, which is called the base flood elevation, is your property above it or below it? These are all things that can have an impact on your property. The history of flooding in your area. These are all things that are used in a flood risk score that companies like to use. So the higher your flood risk score is, traditionally, the higher your flood premiums could be, not just today, tomorrow, but 36 months from now. Because remember, you want to prepare when you're purchasing this flood insurance of, hey, what are my rates going to be today? What are they going to be next year and the year after? You want to make sure that affordability stays in play here. So maybe you're buying a property where flood zones are going to change, if flood risk score is going to change because of things that are changing in your area. Maybe your community is pulling out the National Flood Insurance Program. And that could have a big impact. These potentially are all things that your flood risk score could tell you. So you want to make sure to understand that. So we've talked about flood zones, we talked about flood risk scores. Now let's talk about the basics of flood insurance, what you're actually buying to protect that house, to have that peace of mind, satisfy that bank, to avoid financial devastation. First of all, we're going to be talking about building coverage. When we're talking about building coverage here, we're talking about anything that is physically attached to the building, inside, outside, air conditioning, furnace. If it's on the first floor, we're talking about things like a dishwasher, refrigerator, cabinets, all these different things. When it comes to building coverage, how much building coverage do you need? Question we get every day. Unfortunately, it's also something we see people get incorrect information on. When it comes to building coverage, you don't want to satisfy the loan amount on your bank. A lot of times this means nothing. The lower your loan amount is, the lower the premium could be, the lower the flood insurance coverage could be. You want to have coverage in place that if your house was to flood, your house could actually get replaced, not just get your loan paid off. It's not going to do you any good. So when you're getting that quote from whoever you're getting it from, have them use a replacement cost estimator to tell you what you need to look at. Now here in 2024 in residential properties, what we recommend starting at is about $150 to $175 a square foot. That gives you an idea on building coverage of how much you actually need. Don't just go with that, probably that $250,000 on the building that maybe the bank is just requiring, even though you have a loan for $400,000, because what's going to happen when there's a difference there? You could be held responsible there. Look, you want to make sure you have enough coverage in place where you're not dealing with a big financial problem after a flood because the insurance is there. Now let's talk about contents coverage. This is going to be your personal belongings, your couch, your clothing, things like this. Where do you start with coverage here? One thing we like to tell people to start with is about 50% of whatever you're covering the building for is a good number to start with here. If it's a primary residence, it's an investment property that you don't have much contents in, you might want to start at 10 to 20%. Or if it's a secondary property, maybe a lake property that you just don't have much in there, maybe you start at that 10 to 20%. Maybe that's a good number for you. So when it comes to coverages, that's the building, that's the contents. But what if your property floods and you temporarily need a place to live? This is called additional living expense. And this is definitely something you want to purchase if it's available. And I'll tell you a quick story. We had a property owner that had additional living expense on her policy, had just switched. Her neighbors didn't have it. House floods on this lake in Nebraska. None of her neighbors had a place to live while their house was being repaired, but she did. She had a hotel for 6 months. The emotional stress and the financial stress that it took off her was huge. This is where additional living expense or temporary living expense comes into play. Or if you're a real estate investor, loss of use. What if that property floods and you need that loss of rent? This is where that comes into play. Now we're going to talk about in just a second with the different flood insurance options when this type of coverage is actually available. But those are generally the coverages there. And when you're talking about these coverages though, you also want to think about deductibles. Flood works a lot different than home insurance or commercial insurance. You see, you have different deductibles for every type of coverage. So if you pick a $5,000 deductible and you have building coverage and you have contents, you have additional living expense, you could potentially have a $15,000 deductible. As you can imagine, come claims time, that could be sticker shock. You could also have a separate wait period on additional living expense than you do the other coverages. That's something else you want to look at when you're looking at these coverages. So now that we talked about coverages, when you go to purchase it, what are your options for these coverages? Well, let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program and let's talk about private flood insurance. First of all, the National Flood Insurance Program is the program administered through the federal program that you can buy through insurance agents. You can buy through companies write your own. Basically administer this program. No matter where you go, and listen to me on this, no matter where you go, pricing should be the same unless you're taking over somebody's policy. But don't spend 2 days shopping a National Flood Insurance Program rate, because the only way rates should be different is if coverages are different. So remember that when it comes to the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, what about coverages available with the National Flood Insurance Program? Well, you've got building coverage and contents coverage. Remember, we talked about additional living expense a minute ago. As I shoot this video here in 2024, that coverage currently is not available. However, it could be changing over the next couple of years as the federal government looks to make changes to this program. Now let's talk about private flood insurance. With private flood insurance, every option is on the table. Everything could be different. You could have 5 different options with 5 different deductibles, coverage amounts, all the stuff that's different. So you want to make sure when you're looking at that, National Flood Insurance Program option, you're looking at private, you have at least 3 different private flood insurance options. So you understand, hey, what's the deductible here? What's the coverage amount? Pricing could all be different. We see some private policies, $400 a year, some at $4,000. So when it comes to private, you can absolutely shop private all day long. And we tell people every day, look at all the different private flood insurance options. Those rates are going to be different, unlike the National Flood Insurance Program. Something else you want to look for on private flood insurance, ask about what rates have looked like over a 36-month period when you're out there shopping for flood insurance. You understand, hey, what's going to happen today? What's going to happen next year? Am I getting this really cheap rate this year and it's going to skyrocket next year and it's going to create a headache for me? I got to contact my mortgage company. They accidentally paid a higher payment. Now my payment's going up. These are all things we help people with every day at the Flood Insurance Guru. And you want to make sure to ask those questions before you take out that policy. So you've got your options on the table and you're getting your quotes and you have reviewed all that. You've looked at coverage amounts. You've looked at flood zones. You've looked at flood risk scores. You've done all your homework here on this guide, the flood insurance. So taking out this policy, something else you want to look for is if you're taking out a private policy, you want to make sure they have what's called a private flood insurance clause if you have a mortgage listed. This basically says, hey, this policy mirrors the National Flood Insurance Program and it meets the requirements you're looking for. This way your bank will accept this policy. Now, if you're taking out a National Flood Insurance Program policy, as long as you have a signed app and usually proof of payment, it can be paid at closing. If you're doing it for a closing, that will serve as proof of coverage for up to 29 days if a mortgage company is paying it. If you're paying it as a customer though, typically only have about 10 days to get that payment in, or if an insurance agent's paying it, or a title company sometimes, that potentially could only be 10 days there. So remember that. Now with private, typically, most of them will require you to make the payment up front, provide what's called a declarations page. They call that in the insurance, or what's gonna be called a coverages page. It's gonna list all your coverages, it's gonna deductibles, all this different stuff on there. So that's what to know after you've made this purchase now, that your bank has what they need. So we've talked about all these different things today when it comes to the guide on flood insurance. I hope that this video has helped you with these things, unlike the help that I had more than 10 years ago. Now, if you're ready to take the next steps to understanding flood insurance deeper, remember, you can download our guide to flood insurance in the description below. You can also take the next steps of getting a quote from us in the description below. If you want to know more about the different flood zones we've talked about today, in the corner of this video, we talk about the different flood zones. You can also look at the National Flood Insurance Program versus private flood insurance and all these different things. You can also continue watching our playlist for homeowners where we dive deeper into these other issues. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I look forward to helping you protect your home in our next video. Thank you.